Welcome. I'm your host, Paula Scataloni, the founder of Transformative Harmonics, a podcast that offers listeners a synthesis of ancient wisdom and modern science. Good afternoon. Welcome back to Transformative Harmonics. I'm Paula Scataloni, and I'm so pleased that you're with me on this beautiful fall day in North Carolina. I get to spend an hour with someone that I'm getting to know more and more, and just love that we have this treat for you today. And I'm going to invite you, as always, to kind of drop down a notch, as I always do, so that you can make some space for what we're about to talk about. So if you're driving, that might not be possible. But if you're at home, find a comfy seat and slow down, grab something to drink, and take a deep breath as you feel your way down to the chair, the couch. And in that space, as we create a little more space, a little slowing down, there might be some room to ingest some of the things that Chara and I are going to talk about today. And if there's not room, that's okay. You can always come back later. So welcome back. Today, I am here with someone who I've gotten to know a little bit, and we're going to get to know each other a little more today on the show. Chara Armon is a Ph.D., a thought leader, healer, teacher, and spiritual guide who will work with you to help you accelerate your healing and growth by accessing your soul's guidance. Chara specializes in assisting clients with creating heart-centered and soulful transformation in their lives and work. Chara assists with your advancement through self-empowerment, self-healing, and purpose as you find your soulful contribution to humanity and Gaia. She supports people who are committed to upleveling their thriving and their contribution to the world. Chara has extensive experience with discerning both her clients and her own path of self-healing and service, including the challenges that can occur in health, well-being, and your authentic expression, as that may change along the way. Clients are drawn to her ability to see the value of their path and growth and their calling and contribution to the greater well-being of themselves and all life on Earth. Chara is a writer, gardener, wife, mother, and friend of plants and dogs. She holds 3 humanities degrees, including an Ivy League Ph.D., and additionally, she spent a decade studying flower essence, therapy, shamanism, along with several other energy medicine and biofield therapies, including the Akashic Records, which is how we met. So I love that we're going to circle all the way through many topics today. But welcome, Chara. I'm so glad to have you on Transformative Harmonics.
Thank you, Paula. It's really nice to be here in conversation with you and your audience today.
Great. Well, I thought I could start by just getting to know you a little bit more. Of course, we've had some chats along the way, but I think the fullness of your story, even now before we even started, I realized, wow, we have a lot of different things that we could talk about. So for me, what I find so interesting in hosting a podcast is listening to the different paths that everyone has taken. And there's a lot of similarities between many of my guests. I'm sure we'll hear some of them here with you today, but also your authentic expression, right, of what you're bringing and your contribution to supporting this next level consciousness. So why don't we start with just hearing a little bit about your journey and how you came to this current place of shepherding others through a path that you obviously have been on and had to figure out for yourself along the way.
Yes, thank you. Well, I'll give you some highlights and outlines, and then you're welcome to ask more about any of it if you want to. I guess we'll start with kind of the basic positive aspects. I grew up a good part of my childhood in the high Rocky Mountains in a really small town, a very pristine place So it was isolated, but it was really beautiful and clean. And I had a lot of contact with nature, which was really formative for me. And I had parents who were very interested in holistic, healthy living and spirituality. So that was always a foundation for me. And I've had a lifelong spiritual impulse. I mean, since my toddler years, even an interest in spirituality and meaning. And that partly was pursued as a child when I was, continually reading biographies, trying to understand people's life stories, and then reading spiritual texts from my teens onward. And I ended up doing degrees in medieval and Renaissance history because I was really drawn to the deep spiritual consciousness in that time period and the very interesting developments in social roles. And I loved that work, and I think I was good at it. But when my children were small, I was teaching part-time and staying home with them. And I live in the Philadelphia metro area, which is a very, very pleasant place to live in many ways. But, here I was kind of putting my career on the back burner in order to stay home and raise my children and do things like make sure that they got to have time outside every day. And we would get these air quality warnings in the summer when they would say that, young people and elderly people shouldn't be outside. And I thought, wait a minute, like this is contrary to my values and my life choices. And although I had always been very attuned to nature, I've always been a plant person and a dog person and a flower and herb person. That's existed literally my entire life. At this time when I was, raising these small children in this lovely metropolitan area with lots of forests and gardens and state parks, but also some of these air quality warnings, I got much more interested in environmental topics and the human nature relationship. And so that turned into transitioning my academic career very strongly in the direction of religion and the environment and spirituality and the environment. So that's where I've worked and taught for quite a few years. Simultaneously, as you said, I've studied various spiritual and healing modalities for a long time, partly out of interest and passion, and partly because the more challenging side of my story is that, like so many of us, I experienced a childhood with parents who very much brought their own traumas into their parenting and our household. And I grew up with what I now know to have been a very dysregulated nervous system. And I had a tick-borne illness as a child. I think I had Epstein-Barr from childhood onward. And so by my late 20s, when I was raising children full-time during the day with, a lot of delight, I have 3, and my parenting years, which of course are ongoing, have been one of the greatest highlights of my life. But I was raising children full-time on my own during the day, of course, with support from my husband evenings and weekends. And then at night, I was finishing my doctoral dissertation. And after my second child was born, my health started crashing. And, it turned out to be kind of those mysterious syndromes where you go from doctor to doctor and you have fatigue and you have neurological symptoms and, a whole assortment of various symptoms that are kind of hard to assess. So, I could go on and on about that journey, but suffice it to say, I was eventually diagnosed with celiac. And then quite a few years later, I was diagnosed with multiple tick-borne illnesses and mold illness. And so, although I think I would have been on a really focused personal spiritual path and in development as a spiritual teacher, no matter what, the fact that I've had decades of physical health challenges has really, really kept me on that path of studying spirituality, practicing it, of course, and studying various healing modalities, because as I'm sure so many listeners know, if you end up with things like supposedly chronic Lyme, supposedly chronic Epstein-Barr, mold illness, nervous system dysregulation that's causing, a whole host of symptoms and diagnoses, there isn't really a medical fix. I mean, the fix ends up being in the nervous system. And I would say repairing and regulating your nervous system is as much a spiritual process as it is a psychological process. So I will wrap that up and give you a turn to tell me what you want to hear more about. But I would say, it's that very long pathway of spiritual and healing inquiry that finally led me to realize, I actually have a lot to offer other people. And when I allow myself to notice outside the confines of my trained academic mind, I actually have really tremendous intuitive skills and abilities to support people in areas like, self-inquiry within the Akashic Records. So it's been very fulfilling. More than fulfilling, it's been comforting because it has created wholeness for me to allow those sides of myself to come forward in the last few years.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful, beautiful. Well, yeah, I think as I hear, first of all, it reminds me, so many of my guests and the people who listen, I often talk about this innate sensitivity that many of us are born with into a world which nature is really conducive. If you live in a place where you're around nature a lot, it's really conducive for supporting and nourishing that sensitivity. But as you say, when we move into cities and then the climate change and the environment and the world itself, right, wreaks havoc on the body and on our capacity to utilize nature as a resource. So, I love that your story kind of, you followed those crumbs of finding that passion and that impetus to bring more awareness to nature and to our relationship with nature, which I talk about a lot as well. What's standing out though in the story is I often talk about trauma being a catalyst for spiritual awakening. In your story, it sounds like health conditions led you to understand your trauma more, and then that became, part of the pathway. And so I am curious about what different things you encountered along the way and what you found helpful and something, that stands out for you. Yeah.
No, I would love to talk about that because I know for so many reasons having to do with societal pressures and environmental issues and human lifestyle, so many people are struggling with these chronic and often hard to diagnose and mystery type illnesses. So I always really love to share anything that I can to be helpful with that. I guess I would say that I think most of us initially start on a medical pathway of trying to diagnose and fix something. And if that works for you, great. But for a lot of us with these chronic nervous system trauma related things, you may not get a good, clear diagnosis, and there's very possibly not a medical treatment for it. So, I spent a number of years going to wonderful functional medicine doctors, and that was helpful, right? Like it was good to find out that I and most people in my family have celiac disease. And so being gluten-free is helpful. It was helpful to get the tick-borne illnesses diagnosed through a wonderful functional medicine doctor. And I did treat those and my mold exposure in various ways, with some pharmaceuticals and a lot of herbs and some supplements. But I still wasn't even close to well. And I was really lucky that I knew enough about spirituality and psychology that I never quite ended up being bedbound and on disability. I got close. I would have days and sometimes even weeks where I was getting really close to not being functional and not being able to work. But I was always studying people like Wayne Dyer and, um, you know, Louise Hay and all kinds of others, Michael Beckwith. And so I was getting enough exposure to the mind-body connection that I kept myself from sinking as far down as a lot of people do with, Epstein-Barr and chronic Lyme and mold exposure and all of that. What was a really big turning point for me was when my functional medicine doctor told me about DNRS, the dynamic neural retraining system, because that was the first program I took that really explained how a brain that is in, fight, flight, freeze can actually create these constellations of symptoms that may or may not be diagnosable. They're visible, they're real. It's not just psychosomatic, and they may fit into certain diagnostic criteria. But that program, the DNRS program, was a huge turning point for me because I finally started understanding, oh, it really is my brain. My brain has had so many affronts or assaults or stresses that it's stuck in this mode of creating all kinds of inflammatory symptoms. That was really helpful. And I love to honor that system and its founder. But what I started discovering was that system is really not attuned to people with deep trauma, especially developmental trauma. So I was incredibly lucky to find the work of Dr. Kathleen King, who created the Primal Trust program. I strongly recommend it for any mental health practitioners who are listening. I recommend that they take the program so that they can help their patients. Dr. Kat was herself bedbound for about 10 years with Lyme, mold, many, like dozens of diagnoses, unable to raise her children. It was very extreme. And finally, after she had exhausted all of the medical possibilities and they had made no difference and she couldn't leave her bed or have lights on in the room or anything, she started thinking back to her training as a physical therapist and some of the approaches like eye movement exercises that help to calm the nervous system. And from there, she herself found DNRS and then eventually realized that although DNRS is wonderful, it doesn't address the needs of people who have a lot of trauma, especially developmental trauma. So Dr. Kat's approach brings in a lot of inner development, a lot of parts of self-work, a lot of recognition of the difference between wounded or parentified parts and the adult main personality that needs to be taking the lead if you're going to start walking yourself out of these stuck trauma states. And she also, I think, interestingly for you and a lot of your audience probably, she realized over time that somatic practices are fundamental and pivotal for this community of people with this constellation of diagnoses and various kinds of deep trauma in their backgrounds, whether that's adult trauma, like really severe experiences with Lyme and mold, or often, of course, it's childhood developmental trauma. And so that was really a revelation to me because I think the somatic approaches, which were very hard for me to learn because I was very dissociated and I didn't even know I was dissociated. And in fact, I'm still really working on learning those. But the somatic approaches, I think, are where the rubber meets the road in mind-body work. And so I love to just mark for people that probably almost any of us with any kind of emotional or physical challenges need to be doing some somatic approaches for nervous system regulation and whatever kind of healing or recovery we're pursuing. And then, of course, and this is really kind of a whole other topic, simultaneously to all of that, I was doing a lot of work with energy healers and medical intuitives and Akashic Records type approaches. I don't think everybody needs that. I think probably almost everyone can benefit to some level of working with energy healers and medical intuitives. I am a huge believer in those approaches, and I practice some of them myself. But then I think some of us who are very sensitive and might be living certain kinds of lifetimes that are presenting a lot of challenges and a lot of calls for really deep healing at the soul level. I mean, my own view would be those spiritual healing, medical intuition, soul history, Akashic Records approaches are probably pivotal. And they certainly have been for me, giving me all along the way a tremendous sense of clarity, of meaning, of what I was really working through and working on, and what kinds of transformations were possible.
Mm. Wow. So you have covered so many different layers of what healing means. Yeah. The physical, the psychological, the somatic, and the spiritual. And somewhere in there, I think you, at one time, one of our chats, you had said that you did actually also go through sound therapy too, through the program that I use.
Yes.
And even had that as part of your package.
Mm-hmm. I have. I've done the Safe and Sound protocol, and it's been interesting to me to hear you talk about how you administer it, which sounds like a very deep and supported approach. I worked with a trained facilitator, but we just had remote contact, one kind of training meeting, and then I would email her and she would help me kind of calibrate how much listening time I was engaging in daily. I just did that earlier this year, and I thought it was very, very interesting. I really liked the Safe and Sound protocol. I may repeat it at some point for a touch up. I'm thinking about trying rest and regulate. Is it rest and regulate?
Rest and restore.
Rest and restore. Yeah. And,
Mm-hmm.
I can't really speak very much at all to the science of that, although I understand the basics, but I can certainly say that I saw a difference in my nervous system after doing Safe and Sound. And, I'm not going to go into the details right now, but I'll share this example because it might be helpful to people. As I mentioned to you, we're going through a really serious and significant family health issue this year. And I'm so glad that I did Safe and Sound before that developed, because I can't say that I am going through this experience with a perfectly regulated nervous system, but I can say I'm going through this experience with a remarkably regulated nervous system and resilience. And I know that everything I've done has been helpful. All the spiritual tools and types of inquiry that I engage in almost every day have been very helpful. And I think Safe and Sound was a good foundation for me before this family health situation unfolded.
I'm glad. It sounds like, you've done a lot of different things. So sometimes it can be hard to say, the cumulative effect of it all, and then the sound itself. But I like to think of its capacity to expand your capacity to handle stress.
Yeah.
It's one of the ways. So
I think it's really exciting too, because the practices that DNRS and Primal Trust teach are kind of time intensive and a little rigorous. Like, you have to do daily inquiry practices, and you have to do positive visioning to create positive mood states to change your brain function. And that's all really great, but it does require focused effort and as much as an hour plus of time per day. The nice thing about Safe and Sound is, at least in the way that I did it, you just put on the headphones for a few minutes. And so I think that's a blessing to people. It's not going to, heal you entirely, I'm sure, but it's kind of an easy approach. And sometimes we really need that.
Yeah, it's accessible, and you can fit it into your life. Definitely. So what I'm hearing is you went through a lot of different trials and approaches, and the accumulation of those have helped you to be where you're at now. So it's not a quick fix. It's not an easy fix. It's a path of healing. And is that part of then, as you move into this other aspect of your work and what you offer, is there a piece of that you like to weave in around health and self-healing in the way that you sit with clients now and offer services?
Yes, absolutely. Because I don't think we can find anyone who doesn't need some form of healing, and especially people who are on any kind of focused self-development path, any kind of focused path of trying to contribute beneficially to the world, almost certainly need at least some level of emotional healing or transformation and physical healing or transformation. Also, as you referred to earlier, there certainly is a class, a group of human beings who are really heart-centered, really contribution-focused, and have really sensitive nervous systems. And so, that certainly includes me and a lot of the clients who are drawn to me. And I guess I do think not that life has to be hard for sensitive, heart-centered people, but that sensitive, heart-centered people living on planet Earth as it is right now almost certainly have to do extra to maintain their stability and their well-being. And so, that can look like a lot of different things, whether it's nutrition and time in nature, or figuring out that some of our industrialized processed foods are not working for your body, meditation, spiritual inquiry, types of soul healing that are really kind of looking at your soul's long-term experiences and what it's trying to work out or learn in this lifetime. So, I'm not a health coach. I will discuss some of those health and well-being topics with people. And then where I really focus is more on my clients' kind of psychological, emotional, and spiritual choices and perceptions about how their lives are now, how they would like to be experiencing their lives, what they would really like to be contributing to the world, and then what types of inner development and focus might be needed for them to move forward however they want to.
Mm-hmm. So really values driven. And
yes.
Yeah, tying it into their values. Beautiful.
Right.
Well, one of the questions that have popped up as you've talked and you've used words like spiritual growth and soul led is what's the intersection with your academic history and training in religion and different more academically inclined, I guess, trajectory with this more contemporary path of consciousness, and how do you weave those?
That's a really good question. So I would say there are continuities and discontinuities. And maybe I'll speak to the discontinuities first because they're a little bit simpler. I'm still very interested in, the human spiritual and religious traditions. But I think something that humanity is outgrowing right now is an institutionally focused spirituality that's really top down, where people who are supposedly wiser or better than you tell you what to do. And so that's a discontinuity between all that I've studied and taught and what I believe now and offer to my clients, because I think that we really are in a time when more and more people are waking up to that inner sovereignty, that inner sense of divinity, and the ability to be self-guided and self-led. And I mean, as you can tell from my story, I've had a lot of teachers, a lot of people who've helped me in person or through books or whatever. But I do think we're in a time when more and more people are learning I and my soul and my higher self are my main authorities. Continuities, of course, are many because I know from my training as a historian that humans have always been spiritually inclined beings. And I know that the so-called mystical strands of spirituality that are very focused on the divinity within each person and the sovereignty and autonomy of the spiritual path, those have always existed on planet Earth as far back as we know. So those things are not new. They're really age old and time tested. And I do think there's value in knowing that the human spiritual quest has been a really long one with lots and lots of ups and downs. So I guess, yeah, I would say those are some of the aspects of discontinuity and continuity. But probably what I'm most interested in now is supporting other people on that path of self-discernment, autonomy, sovereignty. And again, not that you can't be supported. You can be supported. There are lots of tools. There are amazing books. There are people who can teach you how to meditate, how to do EFT tapping, how to do Eden energy medicine, Qigong, inquire into your own Akashic records. I'm a believer in all of those wonderful modalities. And I think increasingly the real richness and gold lies in, well, where do you feel called? What is your heart guiding you to be and do? And that's what I'm most interested in supporting people with, because increasingly I've come to believe that it's our inner heart-centered authenticity that shows us what our contribution to the world is. And that's really crucial because so many of us know right now that a lot of our institutions are outmoded and need to decline or be rebuilt, whether you want to talk about the financial world and all the inequities that still exist on this planet, gender norms that we're still trying to balance, the way that we're producing things, objects and energy and harming the planet that is our life support system. We have a lot of systems that need to be rebuilt or revamped. And of course, people's intellectual and academic training and professional expertise is important there. But I think what's most important, and I think we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg of this, and it's going to get better and better, is what's your heart impulse about what needs to be done here and what your contribution is going to be. And so I consider one of the most important things that I offer people when I work with them is supporting them in listening to and believing in that inner sense of truth and heart impulse. I think we're at a really important tipping point right now where more and more people are feeling that all is not right in our world and they have some insight into how to make things better, but then they're not sure if they can trust that insight, and they're not sure if it's practical, and they're not sure if they can support themselves bringing that into the world. And those are all, valid concerns, but I really believe we need to be encouraging one another right now. And anyone who needs support needs to be seeing practitioners who will help them trust that inner wise voice, even that divine voice within that says, yes, we truly can heal and repair and regenerate and renew the experience of life on planet Earth. And if you feel called in this direction, then that's really sacred. And there has to be a way for you to make that contribution in a way that works for you.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I feel I'm right in there with you. Helping them to tap into and trust that creative instinct or impulse to bring something forward that is a new idea, a new perception, a different way, because the current state of the world, we can't change it if we're using the same methodology of fixing it as, how we create it.
Right.
So the heart as the pathway of self awareness, of direct revelation, of finding those answers. And so bringing someone into that space of trusting and being with and following, is that part of what led you to do the Akashic Records work? Or were you doing that in other ways and then you just brought that in as an
really
add-on?
good question. So I was already doing some coaching, and I love working, especially with professionals who are at the point that we just named of, I have all this expertise and knowledge, and it could be people who want to be volunteers as well. But, often it's people who want to make a different contribution through their professional path, or possibly changing it. So I was already doing some coaching, and I really love that work. Interestingly, I had been working in the Akashic Records for quite some time. I bought Linda Howe's online course. I wish I could remember the platform that sold it. This was about, 12 or 15 years ago. And I think I paid $15 for the class, which was a huge blessing to me because I was a, part-time employed, mostly stay-at-home mom at the time. And I think I didn't realize at the time that maybe it was unusual that I was able to consult the Akashic Records so easily by reading Linda's 10-page course and reading her prayer. And then I was right there in the Akashic Records. And I think maybe that is a little bit unusual because I've realized since then that my soul has a real facility with the Akashic Records. It's really a home space for me where I feel quite wonderful, and I quite easily receive information. So I actually had no plans to take further training in that area. And it came about very serendipitously in maybe May or June of 2024. My beloved dog had just died, and she was a tremendous soulmate and partner to me. So that really rocked my world. And one night I was listening to John Burgos's telesummit, and Suzanne Alexandria was the speaker, and I was pretty drawn to her. And I had no plans of taking another program. I have kids in college. There's not exactly, tons of spare money laying around. But I remember saying to myself, I am drawn to her. And if whatever she's selling tonight is less than $150, I'm going to buy it. And I think it was $150. So I kept my commitment to myself, and I booked the session with Suzanne and felt very connected with her. It turns out she and I have a tremendous number of things in common. And she told me about her upcoming training program. And I thought, I'm not going to invest in that. Why would I do that? But I kept thinking, oh, wait a minute, like this is really, really calling to me. And then I had a follow-up conversation with Suzanne. And I remember her saying she was being shown that there was no pressure, of course, that, my gifts and skills would unfold in the right timing, no matter what. But that if I chose to engage in her program, things would be very accelerated. And I actually had to take a loan from my retirement account to afford the program. As I mentioned, kids in college. So it was a stretch for me, and it was unplanned. And almost immediately when we started the program, I realized, oh, I work in the Akashic Records with extreme ease. I don't really have to make any effort. All of this information pours forth through me, and people tell me it's really powerful and high level. And that was exciting. It was a little shocking. I felt like I was very much home, but also, somewhat unsure of exactly how I was going to integrate this into my life. So that has been a little bit of the journey since then. And I guess what I would say about the Akashic Records is that I think, there's a prior decade's perception that you consult the Akashic Records to find out cool, amazing, or disturbing things about your past lives. I don't think that's what the records are actually for. And in my experience, that's not the information that the records are yielding. I have, because of my own intense healing path and the particular kind of lifetime I'm in, I have seen quite a few of my past lives, and healers who've been supporting me have. So I will acknowledge, I do think that's valid, and it's been quite an important part of my own life. But what I find the guides want to share in the records now is, here's how to transform, and the goals and intuitions that you're feeling about your own transformation and trajectory are very valid. Here's how to realize them. So, I think because of the point that humanity is at, what the records are offering is not a lot of glitzy or disturbing stories. I mean, sometimes fragments of those come in, but not even very often. It really is more of a direct focus on self-healing and self-transformation, and doing that with whatever kind of spiritual and human support somebody needs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think at the place, in my experience, for perspective and shifts in perception to kind of get a more going from a narrow view of ego into more of that unity consciousness, and to activate that self-healing capacity, which can come through, your experiences through vision. I have sound, and so that we can use that information to accelerate our own healing and growth right now.
Yes. Yes.
Is there a place, and just tying this back to your background in theology and religion, is there a place where the Akashic Records lives in the history of the mysticism and how you hold it, or does it feel more contemporary? Your approach or thought about it is more
That's a good question. So I haven't investigated that in any kind of scholarly way. I know the Italian physicist Erwin Laszlo has written a little bit about that. I think my understanding is that Buddhism has a long-term awareness of the Akashic Records. I'm trained in the history of Christianity and not Buddhism. Of course, there's reason to believe that at its founding, Christianity and some of the early Christians may very well have had a robust belief in the multiple lifetimes of a soul. But as Christianity developed, it developed this emphasis on the one and only lifetime, in which case the Akashic Records don't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. I guess what I would say is, I certainly believe the Akashic Records have always existed as a divine universal reality, and some human cultures for a long time have known about them and consulted them, but that the reason they are relevant now and gaining attention in recent decades, certainly in the West and I think throughout the world, is that humanity is waking up into a greater spiritual maturity. I would say it's been visibly happening for millennia, but most visibly happening in the last couple of 100 years. And so now more and more people are ready and able to think about themselves as having a soul that has a long history, that is a fragment of the divine, that is going through learning and healing processes that can transform and move forward or ascend on the kind of embodied path in various ways. So I think that's what is most important now, is that humanity is at a point when more and more of us can access that Akashic field for ourselves on our own. And I'm starting to teach people to do that. In some local live classes. I may start doing that online as well if people are interested. And of course, you can have the support of a practitioner. And I do think that's really, really valuable. I just did a session yesterday for a long-term friend who is herself she's a psychologist like you and also a spiritual practitioner. And we were agreeing that it can be challenging to hear for yourself because one's ego, fears, self-doubt do pop up. So I think there's an interesting opportunity now for more and more people to learn to access their records on their own, which is really empowering and is something you could do every day or once a month or once a year, whatever is important for you. And there is a role for sometimes consulting a practitioner who's going to be able to listen in a more neutral way and not be blinded by your fears and blind spots in the way that, everyone as an individual inevitably experiences some blind spots.
Yeah, I agree. I like to think of it as if we're opening the records for ourselves, we're tapping into our own embodied wisdom, having a direct conversation, right? With that intelligence. But there's times where, because of our angst and our wanting something to be a certain way, that it can be helpful to have a completely neutral party.
Yes.
So the information's not skewed at all.
It's true. And I'd like to add a little something there, if it's okay. This is something that you and I have talked about and that we've talked about within our learning and study group with Suzanne Alexandria, and I've discussed it with other people. It is possible to be certainly discerning and somewhat scientific in your consultation of this kind of spiritual insight. And I do want to lay that out for people, because when you are just learning, or say you consult someone who has some ability, but they're not as clear and well developed as they could be, you can hear things that are more or less accurate. If we think about accuracy on a continuum, it is a continuum, and there is the human ego. And then of course there's the difference between guidance someone perceives and how they voice it. So I really do like to encourage people to play around in a focused way with being as scientific as possible. If you have a really major thing you're working on, ideally you're going to talk to at least 2 or 3 trusted intuitive practitioners. And then if you're getting to the point where you're starting to do your own inquiry, ask your question in multiple ways and ask on different occasions, and, ask specific questions, but then also ask things like, what would you like me to know or understand about this right now? I do think that's really important, is that discernment and the kind of, I guess I'll call it fact checking, because humans are still living in a kind of fog of lower vibrational consciousness. And a lot of us are learning to pop up above that. But it doesn't mean that everything that you think you receive in terms of spiritual guidance, or that some practitioner who may or may not be highly developed, doesn't mean that everything that you encounter as spiritual guidance is as true or accurate as it could be. So I think it's really important to use discernment and kind of do your research from multiple angles if you're really trying to gain clarity on something.
Mm-hmm. What a beautiful way to bring in that science and sacred together, that they can live side by side, right? Mm-hmm. And you can use both of those together.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of science, I mean, you can actually compare your insights to things like medical tests that you or a loved one have. And I think that's a great way to practice is, ask for guidance about something. And then if you're going to have some kind of scientific medical evaluation, compare, toggle back and forth, because there are a lot of valid ways for us to gain information. And ideally, they talk well with one another and support one another and hopefully confirm one another.
Mm-hmm. I love it. Well, one of the things I've appreciated about you, and I want to make sure we mention this before we close, is your ability to support people as they make decisions about their career or path and get really tuned into their heart's guidance. And so I wanted to just create some space to check in on that. If that is a type of thing that you enjoy, and the why behind that.
Yeah, I really love that. And I think it's because I carry a lot of transformational energy myself. And I think, like many of us, I'm here at this time on the planet to be one of the millions of people who help create transformation and transition from the ways we are living to the wiser, more regenerative, more unity consciousness, compassionate ways of living that are possible here. And they're very much already coming into existence. So I think I would say probably that's my biggest passion, is supporting my clients in discerning what their role in that is. And, it might be something in your household, your community as a volunteer. It's very possibly or probably something in your profession. Most of my clients are working on both that inner transformation and then how to translate that into their work and their contribution. But I just wholeheartedly believe that there is a lot of transformation and system change happening on our planet. I think it's actually quite easy to find evidence of that. And if you're only reading the mainstream news, you probably don't know what I'm talking about. So go sign up for the daily free emails from the Optimus Daily Solutions, the Good News Network. I mean, on and on, people can email me if they want a list, but there are so many news organizations that are reporting on the transformative things that are happening, the Transition Network, all kinds of organizations. And I think that type of evidence can really help you see there are tremendous shifts going on here. And so, what I really, really love to do is support people who feel a calling to contribute to that transformation for people and planet as humans rise into a higher consciousness that is much more heart-centered, compassionate for the self and the other, and creating a much more unitive, compassionate, and regenerative way of being on this planet.
Well said. Well said. Yes. Well, I am right there with you. And I'm so glad you're here doing what you do. And I would love for people to connect with you. How can they find you if they're interested in hearing more?
Yes. So my website is alightinstitute.com. So it's ALIGHT institute.com. And there's a free gift there if you want to sign up for the newsletter. It's a document that guides you through some ways to be living right now as a light to yourself and our world. There is a podcast. For several years, it's been called Humans and Earth. It's now renamed the Alight Podcast. And you can actually hear my past episodes where I talk about a lot of these topics, about the kinds of evidence that we do have right now, that we actually are not living in a time of massive decline, but a time of messy and positive transformation. So feel free to go to alightinstitute.com if you'd like to work with me, be on my newsletter list. You can subscribe to the podcast on YouTube or on any of the major podcast players. And I really do love to work with people one-on-one. I will probably be bringing forward more online group programs as I've done in the past. But right now I am primarily working with people one-on-one, either in that coaching capacity or more in the Akashic Records sessions. And it's my honor and privilege to be available in that way. So I'd love to hear from anyone who wants my support or resources.
Wonderful. And I will vouch that you will not be disappointed to sit with Chara and create space to learn more about yourself and your path and why you're here. So we will end with that. Thank you, Chara, for spending time and just sharing this chat with me and my listeners. As always, hope that some of this landed in a place where there was space. And if not, feel free to listen to the episode again. And you know where to find Chara.
Thank you so
much,
much,
for
Paula.
joining us.
It was great to be in conversation with you.